Kambhampati. He is a computer science professor at Arizona State. He's also the president of the Triple AI, the Association for the Advancement of AI. And as he's setting up here, I'll mention that he is also close to where he took his PhD at the University of Maryland, College Park. So welcome back to the DC area.
Thank you.
And you're up.
Let's see if it works. Okay. So I am actually not going to talk just about my research, although I will show a couple of videos on human-robot teaming. That's sort of, the direction that I go through. Based on what Fred was asking, I have decided that we will talk about sort of represent the field for you guys and talk about how we got there. I think Rob did a great job, for example, of pointing out what's going on in deep learning. And then I want to sort of talk about some of the intellectual fallouts of those currently in the field, and talk a little about the thresholds that that we still have to cross before we need to worry about human-level intelligence. And then since, after all, this is a intelligence community studies board thing, I'm going to talk about attack surfaces and how people can actually do bad things with good technology, which is the life that we normally lead. So I basically, I'm going to start by talking at slightly high level about the fact that there is no such thing as a single intelligence. We all really realize that intelligence is multifaceted. One very useful thing that I find in explaining how AI is where it is right now is to realize, for example, that there is perceptual and manipulation intelligence, the ability to see the world, the ability to move around, manipulate the objects, the emotional intelligence, the social intelligence, and of course the cognitive intelligence. The interesting thing is, if you see this little kid here, if you think about human babies and how they start showing about what we see, glimmers of intelligence of various kinds, you see that they go with, first they see the world, then they sort of start putting everything into their mouth, amazing, beautiful manipulation that is needed to put things into your mouth. Then they show some emotional intelligence, show social intelligence when they go to grade school, and then finally, only when, later on, they start showing glimmers of, the cognitive intelligence, the SAT tests, and how to do well, etc. in those. And keep that in mind. And interestingly, AI's progress towards intelligence has been somewhat different, actually. The first time you heard about AI in big time was in around 80s, when there was this whole expert systems where we were trying to replace experts, legal scholars or doctors and so on. In 90s, we had reasoning systems. Kasparov, for example, got dethroned. Chess is no longer the thing that we considered our domain. And it's only in 2000s, in fact, late 2000s, that we started making really good progress on perceptual tasks. So, for example, now speech recognition has become commonplace. Image recognition has improved significantly, as Rob has pointed out. And of course, there are lots of interesting issues that still need to be done in combining these progresses. But at this point, I want you to notice that the arrow for the machines, the AI, has gone the opposite way. We actually figured out, at least to some extent, how to do some breakthroughs in cognitive and reasoning tasks, and only recently have gone to perceptual tasks. And I think it's a useful thing to keep in mind, because it turns out that, at least based on, if you are somewhat on the outside of the peripheries of the field, it explains a whole lot of what's going on about what people are talking about AI. So why did AI develop in this reverse way? It turns out that it's easier to program computers on aspects of intelligence for which we have conscious theories. And how many of you have heard of Polanyis paradox? Michael Polanyis is this polymath who basically pointed out something that we all know, that we actually know more tacitly than we can actually verbalize. It turned out that that's not all the thing that we know, but there is enough that we only tacitly know. And the stuff that we know tacitly, we couldn't make progress on it in AI by just telling the computers to do, because we don't know ourselves how we see the world, how we manipulate objects, and so on. In fact, the theories of vision, the theories of robot grasping have fallen by the wayside, and in fact, they have become just learning-based. But in the beginning, of course, since we do have theories of certain other kinds of higher-level reasoning tasks, and that's the ones that we programmed the computers for. And then we are not particularly conscious of the perceptual and manipulative intelligence intelligence. So we had to depend on making the machines learn exactly the way we wind up learning. So, I don't know whether you notice it or not, kids, human babies, those of you who had human babies, right? They basically hang around doing nothing for a long, long, long time and being just cute, right? And what are they doing? In essence, they're sucking up the examples in the world. They're sort of figuring out without you telling them how to talk, how to, do grasping and so on. So that's the kind of thing that, basically we had to do it now. We actually started having to do it with learning. Now, this also actually explains why AI caught public imagination now. So earlier on this morning, Stuart and I were having breakfast, and we've been in AI for quite a long time. For the longest time, when we say we work in AI, there'll be a sort of sigh of disappointment. This is the technology that didn't seem to go anywhere. Now it's please don't hurt us. Apparently, apparently AI can actually take over the world. So why did that? We always had intellectual satisfaction in doing work in AI. I always felt sorry for my colleagues in the department that they're not working in AI for the last 30 years. But why is it that everybody is interested in AI? Well, it's because early AI was blind and deaf Socrates. So if you want to think of a kid who can do chess but can't actually see the world or can't manipulate things, that's the kind of thing that you had in AI, And so perceptual abilities allowed AI to come to all the people. And so now, we have speech recognition on the cell phones and Alexas and Teslas. And now, of course, the technology has reached people, and so they see AI as a big thing, but they also lead to a large number of misperceptions, in particular as if intelligence only means seeing videos and seeing pictures and recognizing dogs in them. That turns out is the ImageNet task. We'll talk about in a minute. So that's sort of something that I want you to keep in the back of your mind. And, Rob mentioned, a lot about deep learning, and there's this huge deepening war in terms of, how the depth of the networks have improved our ability to do good perception. That's the perceptual intelligence part. And he also mentioned something that I'm just going to quickly remind you that, some of the large part of the theory, for those of us in AI, and when I teach courses in AI, I tell my students that this is the third coming of neural networks. The ideas have been around for quite a long time. What actually has changed, in fact, Jeff Hinton gave this talk, I think, 3 years back at AAI and pointed out, well, there's a 10,000x speed up in training the networks, and then said there are theoretical advances, there are some things that just happened in the infrastructure, and then after everything, we would hope that it's the theoretical advances that led to a huge amount of this improvement. It turns out, actually, the infrastructural advancements were just as important. How many of you have seen Blade Runner, the movie? If you didn't, please go and see it. But those of you who have seen it, go back and see it again. And you would be surprised at how impressive the movie is in figuring out a far future, but they couldn't imagine that the cell phones would be thin and iPhone-like, or that TVs won't be huge big bricks, for example. So what happens is that as AI was going about doing its own thing, the rest of the technology progressed, and that infrastructural improvements have actually wound up being extremely useful in the success of deep learning. Not just a huge theoretical advances itself, but these infrastructural improvements. That's worthwhile keeping in mind. Now, of course, deep learning has, as Rob has pointed out has had a significant set of industrial successes, and so this also has led to what I would like to say irrational exuberance. And I don't know how many of you know Archimedes. In addition to running around naked in Athens, apparently he would say that if you give me a lever and a place to stand, I can move the world, because he figured out the idea of fulcrum, right? And so now the version of that for AI is, if you give me a big enough GPU, a large enough data set, and a deep enough network, I'll create you super intelligence. That's exactly what's happening right now, because people see that 150 layers, you do ImageNet, 395,000 layers, maybe robots will take over and there won't be any, there will be Independence Day, the movie in Washington, D.C. Now, this sort of irrational exuberance is important for us to understand both within the community and especially outside of the community in the policymakers and so on. I want to mention this. This is a write-up about AlphaGo, which actually Rob mentioned towards the end of his talk. AlphaGo turns out is not just perception, it's perception plus reasoning. It actually brings two different parts of your intelligence together. No less a supposedly technically savvy magazine than IEEE Spectrum says, Google DeepMind calls this self-guided method reinforced learning, which itself that turns out is a wrong word, but it's really another word for deep learning. So essentially, it's become a situation that now everybody assumes everything that works or needs to work is just deep learning. And so it's important to understand that it does something about perception, but there's so many other things that we need to make progress on. That's what I'll try to talk about. So the intellectual fallout of this particular kind of exuberance has been that AI has always been famously full of pendulum swings. We argued about logic versus probability. We argued about whether AI is supposed to replace the people or should augment the people. And of course, we famously argued about whether AI is a huge disappointment or it's just a doomsday right away. But one of the most useful intellectual threshold pendulum swings has been between symbols and neurons. At the beginnings of AI, Newell and Simon made this physical symbol system hypothesis, which basically says a physical symbol system has the necessary and sufficient means for general intelligent action. Now, of course, Jeff Hinton, who has very ably held the other side of the fort, said symbols are but luminiferous ether of AI. Those of you who have physics background remember what we're talking about. Now clearly neurons, human brain does seem to work with neurons. There's large amounts of questions as to whether neuroscience has any connection to deep networks that exist right now, but there is at least the word neural in it. And then the symbols, on the other hand, while we have the basis of our cognition, our intelligence is neurons, from Greeks on, human knowledge has been codified in symbolic fashion. We talk to each other in symbolic ways, and there is so much that's basically declarative and symbolic about it. To put this in perspective, and also put Stu Russell on the spot, because it's all his problem, this is the textbook, the enormously popular textbook in AI, the 3rd edition, and these are the table of contents of AI textbook. And so I'm going to start teaching this course again 2 weeks from now. And it turns out the neural networks part of it falls within learning within this part. So about 10.5 pages out of 1,000 pages is basically taking the view that we really care only about neural basis, not just symbolic basis. I want you to keep this in mind to understand where AI was and where AI is, what are the things that you're hearing about in terms of breakthroughs that are happening. So the fact that there's a lot of interest in these neural approaches, I think, again, it's great that these things are working, and as an AI person, I take great pride that we can finally do perception well. But it also, anything that works, we tend to think that's the only thing that we ever needed. It's important to keep in perspective what else that we are leaving on the table. So I mentioned Polanyis paradox, that we know more than we can tell. It's interesting to note that the most recent improvements in AI have all been for tacit knowledge, because we don't know how we do natural language processing, we don't know how we do perception. Those are the things where all we can do is, here are examples, figure out yourself, just the way I figured out while being a cute baby. And machines apparently can do it fast. Recent advances in AI have made AI synonymous with learning from massive amounts of data. I could be rich if I just count every industry person who says, oh, you work in AI, how big a data do you have? As if intelligence is all about huge amounts of data. That's worthwhile understanding that the data basically wound up being useful for perceptual tasks. Now, in fact, I recently saw that somebody showed, it's like if all you have is a hammer, you can base everything looks like a nail. So somebody wrote a deep learning approach for Sudoku. Sudoku is this game, obviously, which I hope you know. It just can be described in a few symbolic rules, and then there are ways of solving it. But somebody pointed out that if you just give, instead of those few rules, if you give gazillion, billion Sudoku, beginnings and endings, the network will figure this out. Now, if I'm thinking in terms of autonomous intelligences that sort of populate Mars and they don't have to deal with me, that's okay. But I think many of you, especially in the intelligence community or the government agencies, etc., you, I think, have these things called doctrine. And if you have an employee come and you say, you'd like to say, this is the doctrine that we go by. Currently, if you just go only with the sort of example-based learning technology, what you're supposed to do is convert that doctrine into 10 gazillion billion examples and then give it to the machine. Now, I'm obviously being partly facetious. The important question is, how do we combine this ability to learn from examples as well as learn from higher level knowledge? That's going to be a huge important issue. So I've gone through, in the time of AI that I've been in, we went through, hey, what is this rule-based expert systems, all rules have exceptions, to now, what do you mean rules? What is these rules? What are these models? Everything is just examples and the machine will learn something. The machine will learn something and will do something also leads to this idea of interpretability. So feature or bug. Deep networks learn their own representations, as Rob pointed out. There is very little, especially for image and speech sorts of tasks. There is such a thing called complete input. So everything that is supposed to be in this photograph is in the pixels of the photograph. Everything that's supposed to be in what I'm saying in my, the speech signal is in the speech signal. So presumably, if you give that as the input without actually trying to extract human-engineered features out of it, which is pretty much what the whole history of vision and speech has been, it turns out that neural networks show that the networks actually bring out features better than we can. Now, for cases where we have no clue how we do something, it doesn't matter. I don't really probably mind that the intermediate features of a deep network are not understood. If it is a vision task, although I will point out some problems with that too, but there are things where we have theories and we want to understand what the machine is doing, and there it does matter that the representations that these networks are making is completely their own. So, I like this Wittgenstein quote that if a lion could speak, we could not understand him. So there is this issue of shared representations that wind up being important, especially when you start talking about human-AI symbiosis and collaboration. And that's something that we want to keep in mind. Another challenge, of course, when you don't know what the machine is actually representing, while you can marvel at when it is right, you have no clue what happened to it when it is wrong. So the failure modes wind up being quite hard to understand. And this is important for this community. So humans have this problem. If I show you an example right now, if I show you, I throw like a ball and it falls in the trash can light at the end of that room, you start thinking Rao must be an athlete, Rao must be a basketball player, Rao can do this, Rao can do that. We do huge amounts of example closure. When a neural network or any technology shows one example, we tend to assume it can handle many such reasonable examples. Unfortunately, when it fails, neural networks' failure modes are not yet understood. I'm not sure that this is the end of the world, but it's important to know that we can't understand why they fail. If you have, for example, systems that have symbolic bases, whether they are probabilistic or logic-based approaches, we can understand why this mistake happened, for example. So here, for example, is well-known cases where, let's say, there is a school bus, and you just add imperceptible noise. This is actually magnified, but when it's added to this thing looks like this. How many of you think this is an ostrich? How about this? This is a dog, and I add this. How many of you think this is an ostrich? It turns out that we can make anything into ostrich. Apparently, there's nothing sacred. Even South Indian temples can be made to look like ostriches. I was really unhappy about this. Okay, now the point about specs, so is something that I can talk about outside the thing, but probably some of you know that just because a system shows a particular behavior, we tend to put this huge example closure around it, and we might actually wind up misestimating what it is actually capable of doing. Now, it is possible that the world is full of ostriches, and you just don't see it. And it's also true that human visual system can be fooled too. We are not exactly driven as, snow. So this, for example, how many of you have seen this picture, by the way? Okay, so it turns out this caused a large amount of controversy in Norway because some people basically looked at this and said, oh my God, there's so many burqa-clad women in Norwegian buses. And they started having this humongous backlash about we should stop immigration and we should stop burqa-clad women, etc., etc. Now, of course, Islamophobic and xenophobic these people might be, you can almost see why they thought those are burqa-clad women. Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you tell me at all, can you at all see why this was seen as an ostrich? So you understand what I'm trying to say. The failure modes, you can at least understand. For our failure modes, we have no clue whatsoever about the failure modes of these deep neural networks showing amazing performances. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. Now, given these kinds of problems, you can imagine how great it feels when you see things like this paper which says, oh, just train, you can remove Supreme Court. Anyway, Supreme Court, apparently we can't confirm anybody onto the court. So we can remove courts and judiciary, just train, deep neural network with a large number of examples of mugshots and people who have been finally caught and people who haven't yet been caught. And so they are not criminals, and then see whether you can actually predict on the held out data. And apparently, it turns out that convolutional neural networks will predict with 95% certainty, whether or not a mugshot corresponds to a criminal. And it's not just in China. It turns out there was an Israeli company which was saying we can use facial imaging to identify terrorists and pedophiles. Now, I want you to understand, it's probably, even if you don't care about whether or not phrenology is a science, there is this worry about the failure modes and what are we doing trying to run with a technology just because they have shown some couple of good examples. Okay, it's important to also think of data bias versus algorithmic bias, because many of these systems are going to be trained on large amounts of data, and figuring out whether or not that data is actually representative is actually a pretty darned hard problem. Rob talked about ImageNet. It turns out ImageNet has 1,000 categories. 200 of those are dogs. 200. How many of you can recognize 200 different dogs? Even those of you who are dog fanciers can't. So no wonder humans actually are only at a 5% level, because I can't imagine, recognize more than about 5 different types of dogs. So the point, of course, is what are you training these systems for winds up being very important. And so you're going to have to ask people, show me your data, and then how exactly are we going to do that? And that's something that we want to keep in mind. I want to the next point I want to make is thresholds to general human level intelligence. So I think deep networks are extremely useful in doing perceptual tasks, but we have to keep in mind that intelligence is multifaceted and all these other pieces have to be brought in. So some of the thresholds that I want to mention are common sense, incompleteness, sample efficient learning, and of course interaction with humans that Manuel also talked about. Common sense elaborates the partial specification of facts, observations, norms, and goals. My favorite example is Magellan the Explorer went around the world 3 times. On one of his trips, he died. Which trip did he die in? Okay, if you can't answer, you're probably a robot. Then there are Vinograd schema challenges. For example, sentences are extremely similar. The women stopped taking pills because they were pregnant. Who are pregnant? The pills are the women. And the women stopped taking pills because they were carcinogenic. Who are carcinogenic? Pills are women. You don't seem to have any problem. I'm not going to ask you who got what interpretation, but we don't seem to have any problem. And it's because we bring in humongous amounts of common sense even into what we think is a simple perceptual task. And that's worthwhile keeping in mind. Sample efficient learning, and in fact, having a pipeline to your robot that's more than converting what you know into 10,000 million examples. That winds up being very important. Currently, successful learning techniques are all purely data-driven. And as Rob pointed out, it's very important to try to widen this pipeline. Human learning is so much more sample efficient. At least that's what I hope when I'm giving lectures to my students. Because imagine if I have to tell them how A-star search works by providing exactly 10 million A-star search traces, that would be the end of my life. So we are still far away from McCarthy's advice taker dream. McCarthy at the beginnings of the field basically said, we need an advice taker where you can provide high-level advice, and it sort of takes it in, connects it with the existing knowledge that it has, and operationalizes it. We are still far away from that. And notice that this is also connected to this data doctrine pendulum. We need to be able to have the ability to take higher level knowledge. Incompleteness winds up being an extremely important thing. All these machines, all the AI machines, we are going to be stuck with incomplete knowledge about the worlds that they are going to live in. And so how we do robust reasoning and robust behavior in the face of daunting incompleteness is going to be an extremely important issue. I like part-time defense secretary, full-time philosopher Don Rumsfeld's quote about the fact that there are known unknowns, that is to say there are things that we know we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns. Those are things that we don't even know that we don't know. And we need to talk about all these things, and we need to handle this, and that's a threshold. I'm not saying I have a paper that I can send you. And then finally, something that's closer to my heart, just as it is to Manuela's, is I like humans. Okay, and so the question is, won't somebody please think of the humans? When we are into developing this autonomous technology, can we start thinking about humans in the loop? AI has a curious ambivalence to humans. Whenever we supposedly want to be helpful to people, but anytime we are in the news is because we creamed somebody, like this guy is Gary Kasparov, these are the people playing poker, and this is, of course, Lisa Dodd and KG. So apparently that's the thing that we take. Or when we are stuck on Mars and don't have to deal with humans at all, that's the spirit for you. Now it's almost as if John Lennon said, we want to help humanity, it's the people that we apparently can't stand. Now I want to give you a reason as to why human in the loop, human aware AI systems didn't get as much of an attention in the field to some extent. It's partly because from the beginning we had this worry that if you put the human in the loop, human will do all the work and the robots don't have to do anything. Okay, and it's not surprising because it's not a useless fear, because remember this guy, this is the Turk, the original mechanical Turk. Those of you who think Amazon is the only one which has mechanical Turk, this is the original mechanical Turk, which was its history's most intelligent machine at that time, and it had a little person there. Okay, so we were always worried, and in fact, in the beginnings of AI, even during the time that I've been working in AI, when people tried to put humans into the loop, it was always as a crutch to help a system that's basically, too slow. Okay, so I had in area like planning that I work in, we had humans in NASA helping the planner by going into his search queue and then shifting nodes around. It's as if they don't have a life. Robots are the only ones which have life. But I think AI has progressed much farther now, and we have much more effective technology, and now we need to start thinking about what does it what does it mean for them to work with us? And when they work with us, it's no longer cheating, it actually expands the scope of the AI enterprise. It reduces, of course, some of the off-the-top worries about AI, and then brings up very interesting challenges. In particular, even symbols versus neurons, pendulum swing, winds up becoming somewhat of an academic problem, because while I might well be made up of neurons, I don't have a USB connection, it turns out. And so if a robot has to talk to me, it has to talk in symbolic means. And it turns out explanations, explicable behavior, all these things that we take for granted when we work with each other, the robots better do that. I think it'll be really, really depressing as a human if we grow up and go to the land of robots. We want them to come to our land, so that if the robots and AI systems come, we are designing this future. We are not just sitting there. And so we should be designing a future where we get to be what we are, and they figure out how to deal with us. And so in fact, I show this thing that, one of the pet explanations of why humans have apparently this ridiculously large brain size is not to run away from the tigers of savannah, but to deal with each other. We are always constantly modeling each other's intentions, desires, beliefs, and we do this to some levels of depth, actually. So the two things that actually connected to the research that goes on in my group that I want to mention is teaming, of course, requires modeling the human. Those videos just show that there are videos in my group, but more importantly, we need to be able to do intention recognition. The robot needs to figure out what the human is trying to do, and it needs to also give a heads up to the human as to what it is trying to do. Both wind up being important, otherwise teaming is not going to happen. Now, It turns out actually teaming also requires modeling the human's model of your own capabilities. It turns out that if I, right now, in the middle of this talk, I start jumping up and down, you would be surprised because you had a certain sense of what I'm likely to be doing and what are my capabilities, and my behavior becomes inexplicable because it's not in conformance with what you're expecting me to do. And if I must jump because a huge bug fell on my leg right now, I will jump and I provide an explanation. There's this huge bug, that's why I jump. And so it turns out that explanations and explicability wind up needing the ability to model the other person and what the other person thinks about you. And this actually is a pretty AI complete problem. These are important thresholds that we need to cross to be able to have machines work with us. And then somebody mentioned trust in autonomy. The holy grail of human-aware AI systems is engendering trust in, that for the machines to engender trust in the humans. Mechanisms for long-term trust are complex. We don't completely understand how humans trust each other. However, just like what they say about reputation, it takes a lifetime to build, but can be ruined in a couple of bad deals. It turns out that trust also can be lost if you start doing inexplicable things or providing pretty bad explanations. Okay, so that's about the trust and autonomy. I'm going to take a couple more minutes. Okay, yeah, because I do want to mention the attack surfaces part. So I want to say something about attack surfaces. Of course, in the beginnings of AI, nobody worried about AI attacking because we are not doing anything. But then, Steve Hawking and Elon Musk think we are going to do something. And of course, Hollywood has always been telling us that AI is going to take over. Now, New York Times also tells you, and there's lots of worries about this issue. I do want to mention this, that, as a person in AI, I like this Oscar Wilde quote that I'm in DC, oh my God. Okay, America is the only country that went from barbarism to decadence without civilization in between. Remember, this is Oscar Wilde, not me. Important to know. I'm close to White House. But it almost makes me think, is AI the only technology that's going from disappointment to deadly without touching beneficial in the middle? In my lifetime, people were just sort of feeling sad that I was working in AI. And now, as I said, they're saying, please don't hurt us. And so where did this attack surface concerns come, safety concerns come from? Now, it's worthwhile remembering that every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. And of course, if it's a sophisticated weapon, it can be held in much more sophisticated ways. It provides additional attack surfaces. So I want to separate between three types of worries: accidental malfunction of AI technologies, bad actors forcing AI technologies to malfunction, and of course, superintelligence control. I don't have too much to say about accidental malfunction or superintelligence control, but I want to mention bad actors forcing AI technologies to malfunction is something that intelligence community must be very worried about, and in fact, it's something that is already happening. We don't need robots to take over. We'll do damage to ourselves extremely well using even primitive internet. Now we can use AI technologies. So in fact, I want to mention that in March, we had in ASU, Origins Institute held an entire two-day workshop on AI and envisioning adverse outcomes of AI technology and thinking of ways to deal with it. That's really a 2.5-day workshop, and the report on that is coming out. And it's something that's going to be useful to the people in this. Of course, when we did do this, the press essentially said AI scientists gather to plot doomsday scenarios. That's the way we live in right now. But in fact, we are essentially thinking of fighting AI with AI. You can use AI technologies to actually fight some of the adversarial uses. The kinds of things that are possible already now are voice spoofing, image spoofing, identity spoofing. Of course, I like this cartoon of Internet taking over, Internet of Things taking over. And some of the examples include, there was something just 2 weeks back basically pointing out, as Rob said, there is a cottage industry of people trying to come up with examples that will fool deep neural networks. And in the beginning, there were very specific examples that if you change, the network won't be fooled, but it's much more robust now. So this one is a cat image that, irrespective of what you do in terms of whether you change its orientation, etc., it keeps apparently looking like a desktop computer to the deep network. Robust physical attacks, people are worried about how you can take something like a stop sign and make it look like it's a go speed up kind of a sign. And there's a paper that's coming out on that. And there's also, of course, synthesized videos with lip sync and gesture control. And the part of it that I want to mention last part is AI can be part of the solution here. This is some of the work that we did that's under submission, where it turns out that the networks, the way nature handled viri basically attacking us, was having diversity built in. So that I don't fall sick, my wife might fall sick for the same virus, for example. So we can actually, we looked at multiple deep networks and trying to see how if they have differential immunity to the attacks. And when they and it turns out when they have differential immunity, you can use what's called moving target defense, which is sort of a game theoretic technique to increase the overall performance, even if in fact one or two of the networks are pretty badly affected by some of the examples. So I would not go into this, I would not also go into this, and I will summarize and just say that having made most progress on declarative tasks, AI systems in recent years have found significant success on learning tacit knowledge from data. I want you to keep that in mind. The only learning that's in the world is not just learning from tacit knowledge. You also want to learn from people telling you a few sentences. And if you don't do that, you're in trouble. This has had some interesting intellectual ramifications in the field and also the perceptions of what AI is from outside of the field. We're still far from general intelligence. Significant thresholds remain to be crossed, including common sense and human-aware systems. And AI remains a potent tool as well as a weapon. And the new breakthroughs in perception present, of course, some attack surfaces, not surprisingly. And those of you who were reading this instead of listening to me and saying, the poor spirit, you are the problem. Because we'll ultimately feel too sorry for the robots, so when the robots come and take over, it's because we actually feel sorry for them. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you. So we ran a little bit over time, but we probably have time for maybe one or two questions.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I had a question where you had the image spoof, ostrich, and so on. I just wondered, so
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm trying to get a handle on some of these things are, they're saying it can do all these great things, and then there you go, show them the how you can spoof. I'm just kind of trying to get a handle. Say for example, if you dial, they dial back some of the applications. So say for example, like if you wanted to have, say like a chair classifier, right? And you say, well, one of it's a rocking chair, or a wicker chair, or this kind of chair, or whatever. It's, to a simpler, classification task, right? And then it wouldn't be like chairs behind, just very simple. It's a chair. It's not hiding behind.
Yeah.
Tables or whatever. You see the chair. It's clear. It's a chair, right? And then you add a bunch of noise. So you train it. You've got different kinds of chairs and different angles and stuff. And then you can throw a bunch of different kinds of noise at it. Would is the technology?
So first of all, let me point out the following thing. The thing about adversarial examples in machine learning actually has been a positive thing. This is deep learning researchers being ahead of the game and trying to see, since we don't understand exactly why it said yes to begin with, what are the conditions under which we can make it say no, it's not a dog when it's a dog, okay? And so what actually winds up being, the theory of deep networks is actually much simpler than the rest of the huge AI textbook that Stuart has written. It turns out it's basically chain rule of differentiation being used for backup, the changes in weights. And what you wind up doing in getting the adversarial examples is you keep the learned network structure constant and you keep fiddling with the feature, the image, changing its intensities in various places until you make the network do the wrong thing. So it's like I show you a picture, keep changing it slightly until I ask you, do you now see burqa-clad women? Okay, and if you do, then suddenly that's going to be an adversarial example for you. Except it turns out that the adversarial examples that I can make for you, you have a sense of why it happened. For the machines we don't yet have. And so it provides a great adversarial attack surface right now. So that's the thing.
Yeah,
Yes,
over here, sorry.
Actually, how much of those adversarial attacks are the result of max pooling within the convolutional neural network?
I cannot be sure. I think there have been a variety of, in fact, this basically shows the variety of ways people have used in developing the adversarial examples. And, it doesn't look like there was any single piece of the network configuration that can somehow be magically changed so that you can get robustness. If so, we would have been ahead of the game. That's why in the work we did, we essentially tried to use the differential immunity across the networks to provide the ensemble have higher robustness than otherwise. But I think there may well be an answer, but it doesn't exist right now. If so, at least that would be taken care of, and there would be other kinds of adversarial examples that might still remain. Okay?
Okay. So I think we've just hit time. We can pick up some more questions on the panel. Please join me in thanking